This is not the first military intervention against a sovereign state in the name of justice. They try to impose their model on others, inevitably bringing death, destruction, desolation, and dilapidation. Nor is it the first time that they retreat hastily and resignedly, ridiculed by the whole world in a complete failure.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
If successfully destroyed, should permit.
The only superpower in the world claimed it would revenge for its people. On October 7, 2001, the United States of America and its allies opened fire in Afghanistan. This is the first war of the 21st century. On one side was the United States, whose GDP was 10.58 trillion US dollars, accounting for 31.6% of the world. On the other side, the GDP was 2.46 billion US dollars, less than 0.01% of the global total. This is also the war between the richest country and the poorest country. First, it was the Special Operations Force Squad who infiltrated quietly. Then the Marine Corps, the Army, and Airborne Division. The Americans quickly dominated the ground. In 1 year, the Bagram base changed from an airport with only an old runway to one of the most powerful military fortresses in the world. At its peak, it had 40,000 soldiers stationed and supported 140,000 operations a year. Carrying more than 7 tons of ammunition, the F-15 and F-16 fighters can destroy a town at a time. Carrying machine guns that can fire more than 600 rounds a minute, the Apache attack helicopters can tear a crowd apart in seconds. Through the giant C-130 and C-17 transport aircrafts, weapons, food, medicine, clothing were continuously transported to Afghanistan. The United States spent more than $2 trillion US dollars on this war. The Obamacare, aiming at achieving universal health coverage, cost just $940 billion US dollars and was rejected. The United States owes more than $3 billion US dollars to the United Nations, UNESCO, and WHO. The money was originally planned to be invested in poverty reduction, education, and medical services in the world's poorest regions. The frontline operational bases, like the fortresses established by the ancient Roman army in Germania, were spread over the barren land of Afghanistan. Soldiers, civilians, contractors, and merchants gathered here. The hospitals, churches, shops, and stadiums supported the invasion of an empire into another country. At its peak, there were more than 50 frontline operational bases operating in Afghanistan to support American infantry's patrols and fights in remote areas. The Taliban seemed to be routed overnight, but they had never been completely eliminated. They just left Afghanistan or hid in the countryside.
After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden also left Afghanistan and was killed. Omar died, and his successor Mansour was also killed by the Americans.
The transition in which we are going to be turning over responsibility for Afghan security to the Afghans.
Obama once said that the Americans would leave, but he increased the American army in Afghanistan. In any case, over 20 years, more than 7,000 days and nights. The firefight had never stopped. And it became a war between the army and the civilians.
We're at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities.
The Americans are determined to bring their own political system to Afghanistan, a country with completely different history, culture, and circumstances. And they did establish an elected government in Afghanistan. But the right to life is the most fundamental right of the Afghan people. These are the fatal attacks in Afghanistan in 20 years. American researchers believe that the war in Afghanistan had cost about 241,000 deaths, including more than 71,000 civilians. However, the number of deaths due to diseases, lack of access to food, water, infrastructure, and the indirect effects of war cannot be accurately counted. On a field road not far from the village in Kunduz, northeast Afghanistan, more than 90 civilians were killed in missiles fired by American F-15E fighter jets supporting the German army. In the end, Germany announced that it would pay $5,000 to each victim's family. In Khojani district, Nangarhar province, eastern Afghanistan, 30 people were killed and more than 40 were injured in a drone attack on more than 200 farm workers resting in a field.
These people were working in the fields, making very little money. Don't the Americans see that they were just working and gathering pine nuts? Why do they attack ordinary workers?
In northern Helmand province, southwestern Afghanistan, at least 40 people were killed in a drone attack on a wedding ceremony. Most of them were women and children. By the first quarter of 2019, the number of civilians killed by U.S. and the coalition operations had surpassed the number of civilians killed by rebel attacks.
Now, Army First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence is a free man.
The killers were pardoned by the President of the United States and were not even deprived of military honor. Hospitals were also bombed. At Kunduz Hospital, 30 people died. Many were shot and killed by planes after escaping from the burning building. At Bagram Air Base, the secret prison is twice the size of the infamous Guantanamo, but the number of people in custody is 3 times that of Guantanamo. When prosecutors of the International Criminal Court wanted to investigate these war crimes, the United States declared it would boycott these actions to uphold human rights.
You should not assume that you will still have or will get a visa, or that you will be permitted to enter the United States.
Many people have lost their lives and many more have been displaced. Now, 18.4 million of the 37 million population in Afghanistan are facing the shortage of food, drinking water, and medical care, and need humanitarian assistance. More than 6.7 million people have become refugees. Since the tents used by refugees are donated by international organizations, they can be easily identified by satellite. Here, hundreds of people use one bathroom, lacking water, food, clothes, and everything. This is the place where human rights are violated the most on this planet, and it has also become a breeding ground for terrorism and extremist religious forces. However, the perpetrators claimed they would give the Afghan people freedom and democratic rights, and therefore implemented military intervention. What they have destroyed is not only human lives, but the future of a country and generations of its people. After 20 years, the Afghan people have lost faith in the democracy and freedom promised by the Americans. In the 2019 presidential election, only 1.8 million people voted. In terms of GDP growth alone, Afghanistan seems to have made rapid progress over the past 20 years. But behind the development is the consumption stimulus from foreign troops and foreign aid that accounts for more than 40% of GDP. For a country, the foundation for survival and life of its future generations has been destroyed. In Kabul province, as the Kharez was abandoned and thus no longer covered and maintained, satellites observed a series of circular holes on the ground. As early as over 1,000 years ago, the wise Afghan people had carried out underground irrigation. But today, up to 70% of Kharez may have been abandoned. In Afghanistan, where the average annual rainfall is only 240 millimeters and 80% of its lands are mountainous, water conservancy facilities are the key to agricultural production. In the past 20 years, although Afghanistan's population has increased by 87% and the GDP has increased by 705.3%, the per capita food production has fallen by nearly 16%. Foreign funds have not been able to feed Afghans. Repairing these facilities will require the efforts of at least a generation. Enveloping almost all of Afghanistan, the sandstorms can be clearly seen from more than 500 kilometers away in space. Between 2010 and 2020, northern Afghanistan experienced the most severe vegetation shrinking. On the satellite analysis images, the depth of yellow represents the intensity of the recession. Afghanistan's fragile ecological environment is further deteriorating due to logging and burning. This is a devastating consequence that may not be repaired in a generation. The lack of vegetation makes water not only more scarce during droughts, but also more prone to cause flood during rainy seasons. In May 2018, satellites observed by infrared that an uncontrolled and undrained flood in the farmland-filled Baghlad caused the moisture content of crops to exceed the warning line. Soon, they will rot in the mud and water. Deforestation has also increased landslides. In May 2014, landslides killed more than 1,000 people in Badakhshan province, northeastern Afghanistan. Due to the lack of an effective management and disaster mobilization system, there was only one excavator on site to carry out rescue operations for a long time. Agricultural production has regressed, while the development of Afghanistan's vast mining resources has been stagnating. Hajak Iron Mine, with a deposit stretching for 32 kilometers, is the largest undeveloped iron mine in Asia. In 2011, Indian and Canadian companies won the bid. But nearly a decade later, there is still no sign of development from satellite images. No hardened roads, buildings, and other infrastructure are identified here. The collapse of governance has increased all risks. Many of them are devastating. On February 13, 2021, hundreds of tankers waiting on the Afghanistan-Iran border were destroyed by fire. Other damages are the destruction of a country's history and future. Constructed at the end of the 4th century BC, this is the ancient city of Ahunam in northeastern Afghanistan. From the historical images, it can be found that Greek-style buildings, temples, palaces, arenas, amphitheaters were all over here. But now, it is almost flat on satellite images. Many people said that Afghanistan is a country without a future. But all this comes from the longest war. This is the GBU-43 Massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, the mother of all bombs, that exceeds 9 meters and weighs 9,797 kilograms. It is the most terrifying weapon in human history, except for nuclear bombs. On April 13, 2017, the U.S. military used this weapon for the first time in Nangarhar, Afghanistan. On the satellite image, everything on the ground is smoothed out. Just like this country, nothing is left.
We will also support programs to train new police officers and to help establish and train an Afghanistan national military. The United States is also committed to playing a leading role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy.
Although the natural environment has been destroyed, satellites still observed obvious vegetation growth in Helmand and other areas in the past 10 years. This is the largest poppy growing area in Afghanistan. This is the Nad Ali region, where food and poppies grow together on 24,366 hectares of land. Through the unique chlorophyll changes of poppy, satellites can identify this plant more accurately by using infrared reflection. Satellite observations show that in 2010, there were about 65,000 hectares of suspected opium poppy cultivation area in Helmand province. In 2020, it increased by 78% to 116,000 hectares. In 2000, the Taliban government announced a drug prohibition, reducing the area of opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan from 82,000 hectares to 8,000 hectares. But 20 years after the U.S. military overthrew the Taliban government, this country now supplies 80% of the world's drugs. As seen in Helmand province, poppy cultivation is extensive and open. Western media reported that the U.S. military provided protection for the Afghans they supported to grow opium poppies, thereby obtaining funds for the purchase of weapons. In areas of northern Afghanistan that had never been controlled by the Taliban, many photovoltaic panels can even be seen in suspected opium poppy fields. In Afghanistan, the most developed areas are often drug-related. This is the Musaburg area in the northern part of Helmand province. Since 2013, the drug factories, trading venues, and the entire city in the Musaburg area have been developing rapidly. But in Afghanistan, where roads are rare and the border is heavily guarded, how can thousands of tons of drugs be transported out of the country every year? People have always suspected that unchecked CIA transport planes and U.S. military transport planes were continuously transporting Afghan drugs to all parts of the world. Because they are the largest transport force in Afghanistan, and no one else has such capabilities. An increasing number of locals are planting poppies on their own land instead of wheat and potatoes. More and more children have discovered that drugs are their best future since childhood. Military intervention and war can destroy a country in many ways. Destroy everything that was once beautiful. Destroy the foundation of its present existence. And destroy its hope and future.
But we will shift into a support role as Afghans step forward. As we do, our troops will be coming home.
Had tremendous success in Afghanistan in the killing of terrorists, but it's time, after all these years, to go and to bring our people back home.
2 U.S. presidents once said that the U.S. military should leave Afghanistan, but they stayed in this country for another 10 years. On October 3, 2009, Kandesh, Nuristan province, a U.S. military post was attacked, killing 8 U.S. soldiers and wounding 22 others. In the end, the U.S. troops retreated and blew up the outpost.
Lance Corporal Benjamin W. Smith. Honor the dead.
In the 20 years, more than 2,400 U.S. soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. More than 20,000 were injured, and more than 3,800 U.S. security employees died. But the victory seems to be getting farther and farther away.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. The United States will begin our final withdrawal, begin it on May 1 of this year.
The Americans left in a hurry and in a mess. The death of thousands of soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians became pointless overnight. Even the most steadfast ally of the United States cannot accept such a defeat.
And the trouble with this decision is that our friends are now anxious, but it's not just about the Afghan people, it's about us and our security.
So this is a shame on all of us, not just America, but also the whole of NATO.
The reason for our current situation is that the decision was taken abruptly.
Except for U.S. military equipment and U.S. soldiers, the entire evacuation was disorderly, panicked, and chaotic. The Afghans, who have fought alongside U.S. soldiers for the past 20 years, have also been abandoned.
My mother has been inside the airport for the last 6 days, but the rest of our family is stuck outside because of all the people at the gate.
There's no information. The US shouldn't have announced anything if they weren't able to take people out.
Feeling deceived and betrayed, people poured into the tarmac and runway of Kabul airport, doing their best and even risking their deaths to climb onto the American transport plane. The U.S. troops suffered the biggest casualties in Afghanistan in the past decade during this retreat. In the past 20 years, the U.S. military has simultaneously launched invasions and military interventions in several countries, but now cannot guarantee their safe evacuation. And their enemies even do not have equipment such as tanks and fighter jets. Full of lies, killings, bullying, death, desolation, and decline in 20 years, this is a war that can be observed from more than 500 kilometers away in space. The military forces of the superpower imposed a disaster on the extremely poor and weak civilians, but they were ultimately unable to win, or even to withdraw in dignity. This is the longest war in U.S. history, and the Saigon moment has not passed away.